Andrea Eilber was born on April 17, 1991, in Flint, Michigan. When she was little, her mother passed away, and after some time, her father remarried. The family eventually moved to the small town of Otisville, where Andrea finished high school. After graduation, she got a job at a supermarket not far from home. Andrea thought about going to college, but she wasn't sure what direction to take yet, so she kept working and saving up for the future. That's also where she met a coworker, a 19-year-old named Kenneth, and before long, the two started dating. In November 2011, when Andrea was 20 years old, her aunt and uncle went out of town and asked her to look after their house. At the time, Andrea was still living with her parents, so she decided to stay at her relative's place until they came back. For the first few days, her boyfriend Kenneth and one of their friends came over. They'd hang out, watch movies, and just have fun together. After that, Andrea and Kenneth made plans to spend the next day together. Andrea was supposed to pick him up on the evening of November 14th, but shortly before that, she texted him to say she couldn't make it. Instead, she told him to come over to her aunt and uncle's place and asked him to bring along some movie DVDs. Kenneth showed up around 7:30 p.m., but the house was dark, the doors were locked, and Andrea's car wasn't there. He knocked, but no one answered. He then tried calling her, but she didn't pick up. Thinking she might have stepped out for a bit, he decided to wait. About half an hour later, he finally got a text from her. Andrea said her plans had changed, then promised they'd see each other the next day. She didn't explain where she had gone, and none of Kenneth's follow-up messages ever got a reply. The next day came and went, and Andrea still didn't reach out. At first, Kenneth was the only one worried. Since she was staying at her aunt and uncle's place, Andrea's dad didn't think much of it when he didn't hear from her. But by the following day, when Andrea wasn't answering his calls either, he started to get anxious. He asked another relative to check out the house, and she went there with Kenneth. They walked around, looked through the windows, but the place was empty. Her father then started calling Andrea's friends, and none of them had heard from her in more than 24 hours. That's when her family began to fear something bad had happened, so they decided it was time to start searching. Andrea's family and friends split up into groups and started driving around nearby towns, parks, and anywhere else she might have gone. By evening, one of her friends spotted her car. It was parked in a remote area near a national park, just a few miles from her relative's house. The doors were unlocked, and the keys were missing. But there was no sign of Andrea herself. Her father immediately called police, who then contacted Andrea's uncle, and with his permission, officers forced their way into the house. When they went down into the basement, they were met with a horrifying sight. Andrea was sitting in a chair, with a gunshot wound to her head. Her body was taken to the medical examiner, who determined she'd been killed by a single shot fired from several feet away. As for the timeline, Andrea had been murdered 2 days before her body was found, on the very night she had planned to spend time with Kenneth, but suddenly canceled. The examiner also discovered markings on her wrists showing that they'd been bound with plastic zip ties, though by the time police found her, those restraints were gone. Even stranger, the analysis suggested they had been removed about 6 or 7 hours after her death, implying either the killer came back later or stayed in the house for most of the night. Investigators also learned that some items were missing from the house, but the scene didn't look like a typical burglary. Almost all valuables were left untouched. Instead, the killer had taken things like a bottle of perfume, a sweater, a camera, 3 knives, a rifle, some bullets, and a bit of cash. Meanwhile, jewelry and even a small piece of solid gold that was sitting out in plain view were left behind. While crime scene techs combed through the house, detectives learned Andrea had a boyfriend and headed straight to Kenneth's place. He told them when he'd last seen her and handed over a DNA sample and fingerprints without hesitation. Police also collected the clothes he'd worn that night and searched his house. But nothing suspicious turned up. Still, they brought Kenneth back in for more questioning, and over time, detectives started leaning toward the theory that he was the killer. Kenneth denied it all and even agreed to take a polygraph, which showed no signs of deception. He explained that on the night of November 14th, after Andrea suddenly canceled their plans, he was crushed. He figured the only reason she'd backed out was because she was planning to break up with him. So he went home, plugged in his phone, and messaged a female friend, telling her Andrea was probably about to dump him. They texted back and forth for a while, and then Kenneth drove to the store where that friend worked. The two continued talking about the situation, and eventually she told him she and her roommate were planning to watch a movie that night and invited him over. Kenneth showed up at their place around 10 p.m., something both girls later confirmed. On top of that, his phone data backed him up, showing it connected to a nearby cell tower at that time. About 20 minutes earlier, he was also caught on a surveillance camera at a gas station located between the store and the girl's house. That same night, police learned that someone had withdrawn $300 from Andrea's bank card. The transaction happened in a town called Davison, about a 30-minute drive from her uncle's house. But here's the catch. The withdrawal was made just 7 minutes after Kenneth showed up at his friend's place. There was simply no way he could have been in both places, yet detectives weren't ready to cross him off the suspect list. Kenneth stayed with his friends until around midnight, then headed home. The next morning, he tried calling Andrea several times, but she never picked up. Concerned, he drove back to her relative's house around 10 a.m. and knocked on the door. But there was still no sign of her, so he left. By about 11 a.m., he was back home, something confirmed by both his family members and his phone's location data. At almost the exact same time, another $300 was withdrawn from Andrea's account, this time in a different town, even farther away. Police also got hold of surveillance footage showing the person using her card. The quality was too poor to make out a face, but one detail stood out. The suspect had arrived in a white pickup truck. But even with all the evidence pointing away from him, police still weren't ready to let Kenneth off the hook. They thought there were a few things about his story that didn't add up. First, he had admitted that he drove to Andrea's relative's house right around the time she was killed and sat in his car outside for about half an hour, which sounded weird for detectives. Second, when Andrea's friends and family organized a search for her on the evening of November 15th, Kenneth told them he wouldn't be joining because he had to work early the next morning. Later, he explained to detectives that he'd already spent the entire day trying to find her, calling her over and over, and figured she was just ignoring him. In his mind, Andrea had probably decided to break up with him, not that something bad had happened. Another red flag came up when one of Kenneth's friends, who'd been out searching for Andrea, asked him for the address of her relative's house. For some reason, Kenneth gave him the wrong location, about 3 miles from the real one. Investigators thought this was strange since Kenneth had spent plenty of time there before. None of this was solid proof of guilt, but detectives pressed him harder and harder, piling on over 10 hours of interrogations. And eventually, police announced that Kenneth had finally confessed to the crime. In his written confession, Kenneth claimed that he went over to Andrea's that night and walked into the house. When he went down to the basement, he said he saw her body lying on the floor and assumed she did it herself. According to him, that's when he decided to stage the scene to look like a murder, so her family wouldn't find out the truth. He admitted to taking a few items that were lying nearby, but offered little else. The confession itself was short, vague, and full of ambiguous wording. Kenneth insisted he hadn't killed Andrea, only that he'd found her body. But detectives believed they finally had what they needed, and they placed him under arrest. The moment police told him he was being charged with murder, Kenneth immediately tried to retract his statement. He said detectives had pressured him for hours, hammering him with accusations until he was completely exhausted. Finally, they told him that if he just wrote down a version of events where he found Andrea's body, they would let him go home. Kenneth said he believed them, but instead, his so-called confession became the cornerstone of the case against him. He also claimed detectives repeatedly misled him. They told him they had solid forensic evidence tying him to the crime, and that he had failed the polygraph miserably. But the most shocking detail came out later. Kenneth's grandfather had actually hired a lawyer and sent him to the station to help. When the attorney tried to find out where Kenneth was being held, one of the detectives simply hung up the phone and then warned his colleagues not to reveal Kenneth's location to anyone. The lawyer spent the entire day calling every officer he could reach, but no one would give him answers. Meanwhile, Kenneth had no idea that the lawyer was even trying to reach him, and he continued talking to detectives alone. According to Kenneth, his so-called confession was nothing more than him parroting back what detectives told him to say, just so they'd finally let him go home. In reality, he claimed, he had no idea Andrea was even dead. Less than 24 hours after Andrea's body was found, detectives announced they had their killer. Kenneth's friends and family refused to believe he was involved, but at that point, there wasn't much they could do. Meanwhile, police basically shut down the investigation, convinced Kenneth's confession would be enough to secure a conviction. Forensics, however, painted a very different picture. Lab experts tested dozens of samples collected from the house, including skin found under Andrea's fingernails. The DNA turned out to belong to an unknown male, and it was definitively not a match to Kenneth. Later, another sample was recovered from Andrea's car, and it matched that same unidentified man. Then there was the whole deal with Andrea's bank card. Someone had been draining her account, but it clearly wasn't Kenneth, and police still had no clue who that mystery man could be. Despite these glaring red flags, just days after Kenneth's arrest, detectives claimed they had new evidence. One officer opened the sealed bag containing Kenneth's clothes from the night Andrea vanished and noticed a single bloody hair stuck to his pants. Tests revealed the hair and blood both belonged to Andrea. But this supposed smoking gun had a huge problem. The pants themselves showed no trace of blood, not even microscopic particles. The forensic specialist who examined the item concluded that the hair must have landed there hours after Andrea's death, because if Kenneth had been wearing those pants during the murder, blood spatter would have been unavoidable. Kenneth's lawyer argued that the hair was most likely contamination. Police had grabbed Kenneth's clothes barely 30 minutes after Andrea's body was found. It was entirely possible that an officer, still carrying trace evidence from the crime scene, accidentally transferred the hair onto the pants while packing up his belongings. Kenneth's lawyer also pushed to have his confession thrown out, arguing that police had deliberately blocked him from seeing his client during questioning. On top of that, portions of the interrogation video had mysteriously gone missing, precisely the parts where, according to Kenneth, detectives were practically feeding him the right answers. The legal back and forth dragged on for 4 years, until the court finally sided with the prosecution and ruled the confession would stay in. During all this time, Kenneth remained out on bail, but he was far from free. He had to wear a GPS ankle monitor and wasn't allowed to leave his house without police approval. The trial began in 2015, and the prosecution leaned on just 2 pillars: Kenneth's confession and the bloody hair found on his pants. Their theory was that the murder was committed during a robbery, even though none of the stolen items ever turned up in Kenneth's possession, and the victim's bank card was clearly used by someone else. The prosecutor tried to smooth over the contradiction by suggesting the robbery was staged. In other words, he argued Kenneth killed Andrea to steal money and valuables, yet also insisted he faked the robbery. This argument was shaky at best, especially since Kenneth's family was well off, and he wasn't desperate for cash. The prosecution also pointed to another detail. There were no signs of forced entry at the house, and Kenneth had a spare key. Andrea had given it to him just a few days before she died, so he could stop by whenever he wanted. But Kenneth insisted he had left the key on a table in the house 2 days before her death. His friend, who had been with him that day, backed up his story. And sure enough, police eventually found the spare key right where he said it would be. The defense, on the other hand, pointed to countless inconsistencies in the case and outright sloppy police work. They also highlighted something investigators seemed to ignore. Andrea's car had been taken and later abandoned a few miles from the house. Her father testified that the car had one particular problem. Oil constantly leaked onto the floor under the driver's seat, which meant Andrea's shoes were always stained. By that logic, anyone who drove the car would have gotten oil on their soles too. Yet when experts examined Kenneth's boots, there wasn't a trace of it. The prosecutor fired back with a new theory. Kenneth must have had an accomplice. According to this version, Kenneth killed Andrea while the accomplice took the stolen items, drove off in her car, and used her bank card. But another problem loomed over the prosecutor's case. The murder weapon was never found. Investigators determined that the missing rifle from Andrea's uncle's house didn't match the bullet that killed her, and neither did Kenneth's parents' guns. Finally, Kenneth's lawyer accused police of completely overlooking other viable suspects. From the very beginning, they had tunnel vision on Kenneth and never gave anyone else a serious look. To prove the point, the defense presented a list of 5 potential suspects, and on the top of that list was a man named Jeffrey, a mutual acquaintance of both Kenneth and Andrea. There were a few red flags around Jeffrey. First, he was the one who just happened to find Andrea's car in the early hours of the search, even though it was parked miles away from her house in a fairly secluded spot. Second, that same day he called Kenneth asking questions about Andrea's whereabouts. The odd thing was, Kenneth had never given him his number. Investigators later learned Andrea had scribbled his number on a piece of paper and left it on a nightstand, right next to where an unidentified DNA sample was later recovered. On top of all that, Jeffrey owned a car that looked very similar to the one caught on surveillance footage at a gas station when someone was withdrawing money with Andrea's bank card. Andrea's brother also pointed investigators toward another possible suspect. He admitted that he had been struggling with drugs at the time and owed money to a local dealer. According to him, this dealer somehow knew Andrea had been saving a good amount of cash from her job. That's why her brother believed the dealer might have killed Andrea to get the money he was owed. There was also a young man named David who came onto police radar after his own father called in a tip, telling them his son could be involved in Andrea's murder. David already had a criminal history tied to car thefts and assaults, and he even resembled the man seen withdrawing money from Andrea's bank card. Despite all this, detectives claimed they had looked into each of these leads, but couldn't find any hard evidence linking them to the crime. When the trial wrapped up, the jury deliberated for 2 full days before reaching a verdict. In the end, they found Kenneth guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His lawyer immediately filed an appeal. At first, the defense tried to overturn the conviction by arguing that Kenneth's confession was coerced and that police illegally denied him access to a lawyer. But the court rejected that motion. Next, the defense focused on the robbery charge, pointing out that Kenneth was also found guilty of theft, even though none of the stolen items were ever recovered. That appeal also went nowhere. But the third attempt finally paid off. Kenneth's lawyer discovered a serious mistake in the jury paperwork. On the verdict forms, jurors were given 2 separate murder charges to consider: first degree and second degree. For the first-degree charge, they had both options, guilty or not guilty. But for second degree, there was only one option listed: guilty. In other words, the jury had no way to find Kenneth not guilty on the second-degree charge. Their only choice was to decide how guilty he was. The appeals court couldn't ignore such a major flaw, and in 2018, Kenneth was granted a brand new trial. By that point, he had already spent 3 years behind bars, and after the ruling, he was released on bail once again. Since then, Kenneth's lawyer kept pushing for new evidence, something that could finally point to the real killer. He repeatedly urged police to retest the existing DNA samples, and in 2022, they finally agreed to launch a fresh review. By that time, Kenneth's new trial still hadn't begun, and he remained out on bail. Forensic experts went back through every unidentified male DNA sample connected to the case. But once again, there were no matches in the FBI's database. So they focused on the strongest piece of evidence they had: a cigarette butt found outside the house. That sample matched the same man whose skin cells had been discovered under Andrea's fingernails, leaving no doubt he was the real killer. Investigators sent the cigarette butt to Othram, a company specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. In January 2023, experts reported a breakthrough. By searching public genetic databases and tracing family connections, they had identified a likely suspect. It was a 42-year-old man named Chadwick Moodley, someone who had never even come up in the original case files. Detectives learned that at the time of Andrea's murder, Chadwick had been living just 40 minutes away in a neighboring town. They pulled his phone records from November 2011, and found out that on the day Andrea was killed, his phone pinged off a tower near her aunt and uncle's house 23 times. By 2023, Chadwick was living in Utah, working as a delivery driver and staying out of his van. Investigators reached out to local police, asking them to secretly collect something with his DNA on it. But there was a problem. Since Chadwick usually parked in open areas, tailing him without being noticed was nearly impossible. Officers kept watch for 2 months, but they never managed to recover a single item that could yield a DNA sample. So, detectives decided to confront him directly. Armed with a warrant, they approached Chadwick and collected his DNA sample. During the conversation, he denied any involvement in Andrea's death. But soon after, lab results confirmed that his DNA was under Andrea's fingernails, inside her car, and in multiple places around the house. And if that wasn't enough, when police searched his van, they found a revolver. Ballistic tests proved it was the very weapon used to kill Andrea. 2 days after that first talk, police went back out to arrest Chadwick. But he was already gone. Apparently, he just drove in an unknown direction right after the conversation with police. 3 weeks later, he turned up in Montana near the Canadian border, where officers finally caught him. But the drama didn't stop there. While being transported to the airport for extradition back to Michigan, Chadwick managed to escape from a police van. He somehow freed himself from both handcuffs and leg irons and disappeared once again. A few days later, a local sheriff happened to accidentally spot him paddling down a river in a canoe. That sighting led to his second capture, and this time, authorities successfully brought him to Michigan, where he was locked up awaiting trial. Bail was immediately denied. After all, he had already escaped twice. Chadwick pleaded not guilty, and prosecutors began building their case. For local law enforcement, it was a nightmare. They had spent more than a decade insisting Kenneth was the killer, tearing his life apart in the process. Then now, the evidence, DNA under Andrea's nails and the actual murder weapon, pointed directly at Chadwick. Investigators even tried to see if there was any link between Kenneth and Chadwick, some chance they'd worked together. But there wasn't. The two men had no ties at all, and Andrea didn't appear to know Chadwick either. At the time of her murder, he was a 32-year-old living in a neighboring town with no connection to her. Still, even with this mountain of new evidence, Kenneth's conviction wasn't thrown out. He remained at home under strict monitoring with an ankle bracelet. What's worse, prosecutors doubled down. They announced they still planned to move forward with a second trial, pushing the theory that Kenneth and Chadwick had committed the murder together. In the end, though, Chadwick's trial never actually happened, because in February 2025, he entered what's known as a no-contest plea, essentially telling the court that he wouldn't fight the charges, but he wasn't going to admit guilt either. He told the judge that he'd been extremely drunk the night Andrea was killed and had no memory of what happened, though he didn't deny his involvement. During that same hearing, a disturbing fact came to light. Some officers had, in fact, looked at Chadwick as a suspect in the very early days of the investigation. But for reasons no one could explain, he never officially made it into the case file. By then, detectives were already fixated on Kenneth, despite the DNA mismatch and the missing murder weapon. In the end, Chadwick was sentenced to life without parole. He also turned to Andrea's family in court and apologized for what he'd done. For Kenneth, though, nothing changed. His attorney immediately demanded that the charges be dropped, but prosecutors flat out refused. They argued that Chadwick's conviction didn't erase Kenneth's alleged role and vowed to move ahead with a second trial. Chadwick himself stated that he didn't know Kenneth or Andrea and had no accomplice, but the state pressed on. That second trial is now set for January 2026, while Kenneth remains stuck under house arrest. Meanwhile, his defense team has secured a well-known forensic expert who reviewed the bloody hair on Kenneth's pants and confirmed what the earlier report suggested, that it could only have landed there a few hours after Andrea's death, not during the crime. Taken together, the DNA, the murder weapon, Chadwick's conviction, and the forensic analysis, Kenneth has a strong chance of finally clearing his name. But the damage has already been done. 14 years of his life have been basically lost. He spent years in prison and years locked inside his own home. Even if the courts recognize his innocence, he'll never get that time back. And if he decides to fight for justice against the officers and prosecutors who did it to him, it could take many more years, with no guarantee he'll ever truly be made whole. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.